In just 6 minutes, Jasmine Crockett, a resilient black attorney, caused an earthquake in the federal courtroom, exposing a white judge's true nature right in front of 3 live television cameras. The question is, how did she turn the trial into a nightmare for the person sitting in the seat of justice? At 8 a.m., the federal courthouse in the Western District was thick with the scent of pressure, as if even the bricks knew what was about to unfold. Jasmine Crockett, dressed sharply in a charcoal gray suit, strode confidently down the long hallway, the cold granite floors echoing beneath her feet. In her hand was a thick stack of files labeled in bold red State versus Lawson, misappropriation of public funds. She was no stranger to pressure, but today felt different. It was not because of the gravity of the case. She had faced armed criminals and indicted police officers before. It was because of the name sitting in the judge's seat, Howard Gates. As Jasmine pushed open the heavy wooden door to the courtroom, her eyes didn't first meet those of the jury or the public waiting in anticipation, but the cold, calculating gaze of the judge. It was slow, deliberate, as if he were sizing her up like a worthless item on a clearance shelf. Gates didn't nod, didn't acknowledge her arrival with any formalities. Instead, he arched an eyebrow, glanced briefly at his watch, then looked at her as if to say, "Why are you here? And do you even deserve to be in this room?" Jasmine felt something tighten in her throat. It wasn't fear, but the realization that she wasn't walking into a courtroom today. She was stepping into a fortress of power, one built long before her arrival. On the defendant's side, Charles Lawson, the wealthy real estate developer, was speaking softly with his personal attorney, absently toying with his expensive watch. They didn't look worried. Lawson even turned to smile casually at a man in a suit near the prosecution bench, as if they were about to watch a cheap play. As Jasmine placed the files on the table, her eyes caught 3 reporters sitting in the last row, nodding politely in her direction. A camera was being adjusted. The court was open to the public today, and she knew every move she made would be scrutinized like a dissection. But what truly gnawed at her wasn't the cameras. It was the elderly woman sitting in the public gallery. Her simple appearance in a worn coat drew attention when a security guard had just told her she was sitting in the wrong seat. The woman stood, bending slightly to apologize, but her eyes were filled with humiliation. Jasmine saw it, and she saw that the white man sitting next to her wasn't corrected, even though he was spilling out of his row. This wasn't a minor discrepancy. It was a silent message from this building about who has power and who doesn't. The heavy door slammed shut behind her. There was no turning back. Jasmine took a deep breath, adjusted her collar, and stared straight ahead where power sat high, cloaked in black robes but with eyes full of bias. Her anger hadn't yet erupted, but it smoldered quietly beneath the surface, like fire under ash. And Jasmine knew today's battle wouldn't just be about justice for the state. It was a confrontation between truth and the decaying power that had survived too long on the silence of those who once stood where she stood. The sound of the stenographer's keys tapping away on the keyboard seemed to punctuate the heavy silence in the room, like an unsettling drumbeat signaling the rising tension that was about to consume the courthouse. Jasmine had barely stepped into the room before the eyes of everyone present were upon her, no longer out of curiosity, but with a calculated, cold scrutiny. It was as if they all already knew everything about her and were now simply waiting for her to falter, to make a mistake, to fail. The defense attorney, an aging man with the polished air of someone who had just come from a high-end cocktail party, slightly tilted his head and exchanged a knowing glance with the judge. The entire room felt like a performance, a play in which Jasmine had not been given the script. Judge Gates tapped lightly on the file in front of him, his fingers drumming with a deliberate slowness, almost savoring the moment. Then, without a flicker of empathy, he looked up and sneered. "I hope Miss Crockett isn't here to turn this into a circus," he said flatly, his words cutting through the still air like a blade. No mention of the case, no recognition of her position as a state-appointed prosecutor, just a single dismissive sentence that hit harder than a slap to the face. It wasn't just an insult to her. It was an insult to everyone who had ever worked in the legal system, to the very foundation of law and order. Jasmine didn't flinch, but inside, something cold and sharp sliced through her chest, a sudden realization that made her stomach tighten. This wasn't just a courtroom she was standing in. She wasn't facing a judge. No, She was standing before a man who had already chosen his side, and it was a side that didn't care about justice. It didn't care about truth. It was a side built on power, on the arrogance of those who had always been above the law, who had never once had to answer for their actions. A soft, mocking laugh came from the back of the room, followed by a few others. The laughter was quiet but laced with venom, just loud enough to be heard but soft enough to escape reprimand. Jasmine could feel their eyes on her. Every sneer, every dismissive glance directed her way. It wasn't just the judge, it was the whole room. Every person, from the clerk to the security officers, everyone who had a role to play in this performance. They were all complicit in this silent, calculated game. Jasmine could sense it in the air, the satisfaction, the expectation. They were waiting for her to stumble, for her to fall, for her to be torn apart for daring to enter a place that was never meant for someone like her. She scanned the room, her eyes moving over the faces of those watching her, trying to find even a flicker of support, a sign of neutrality, someone who wasn't a part of this orchestrated charade. But all she saw were faces locked in stone, frozen in expressions of cold indifference. Each one of them was playing their part in a theater that had been rehearsed too many times for anyone to even think of changing the script. Her grip tightened around the stack of files in her hands, her fingernails pressing into the soft skin of her palm. The pressure was almost unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the feeling that was rising inside of her. She had been here before. The feeling of isolation, of being the only one who didn't belong in a room full of people who had all the power. She had felt this when she fought the police as a public defender, when every step she took felt like walking on a razor's edge. But this time, this was different. Today, she wasn't just facing an unjust system. She was up against a system that was already rigged, already set in place. The judge wasn't impartial. The defense wasn't interested in the truth. They had already chosen their winners and losers, and Jasmine knew deep in her bones, that if she didn't play every move perfectly, if she faltered even slightly, she would be crushed. It wasn't because she was wrong. It wasn't because she didn't have the truth on her side. It was because she dared to step into their world. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be in this fight, this space where power had always belonged to others. And they had made it clear from the very beginning that they would stop at nothing to make sure she failed. Every glance from the gallery, every judgment from the judge, every word from the defense attorney was designed to make her feel small, to make her question whether she belonged here at all. The weight of their expectation was heavy, suffocating, and Jasmine felt it all around her. She wasn't just fighting for justice in this case. She was fighting for her own place in a system that had been built to shut her out. And she knew, in the deepest part of her being, that if she didn't succeed here today, it wouldn't just be a loss for the case. It would be a loss for everything she had ever fought for, everything she had ever believed in. This wasn't just a courtroom anymore. This was the battleground where the truth would either rise or be buried forever beneath the weight of power, prejudice, and injustice. And if Jasmine wasn't careful, if she didn't take every step with precision, every word with purpose, the crushing weight of their expectations would drag her down, and she would never rise again. The silence in the room deepened, thick and suffocating, the calm before the storm. Jasmine was standing at the edge of a precipice, and the only way out was forward. There was no turning back. The courtroom might have been rigged, the odds stacked against her, but Jasmine knew one thing for sure. She was not going down without a fight, and she would make sure that no one would ever forget what happened here today. Jasmine opened the file in front of her, pulling out a document stamped by the State Treasury Department, and stepped up to the podium with a calm, unyielding poise. She knew that the evidence in her hands, detailed budget sheets, wire transfer records, and investment fund reconciliations, wasn't just a collection of numbers. These were the concrete traces of corruption, millions of taxpayer dollars illegally funneled into a shell company owned by Charles Lawson. But just as she opened her mouth to present, before she could even get through the introductory line, a voice as sharp as a blade from the bench cut through the air without mercy. Figures? Oh, not this again. Gates didn't even glance at the documents. He leaned back in his chair, fingers interlaced, his eyes wandering as though he were being forced to listen to a tedious lecture from a failing student. I don't have time for boring numbers, he emphasized, then turned to his left, exchanging a knowing look with the defense attorney. A soft laugh rippled through the back row, this time louder, more brazen, as if Jasmine were telling a joke in class rather than presenting evidence of a multi-million-dollar budget fraud. A court officer snorted quietly. The court stenographer stopped typing, lifting her gaze with eyes that were both indifferent and dismissive. Lawson's attorney smirked, tapping his pen lightly against the wooden desk, as if keeping time to a piece of music he'd heard too many times and never took seriously. Jasmine remained composed, but she could feel her chest burning. The offense she felt wasn't just from the words spoken, but from the way the entire room responded, as though the truth she was bringing meant nothing simply because it came from her. She looked up at the jury, hoping for even a glimmer of understanding, but the faces before her all lowered, avoiding her gaze as if she were an inconvenient distraction. No one wanted to get involved in a standoff between a judge and a black female prosecutor. They chose silence, and it was in that silence that Jasmine heard the loudest voice of injustice. "You're not welcome here." Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Your Honor, this data was gathered and certified by 3 independent financial agencies. It reveals an unusual transfer pattern, twice the approved amount into the defendant's own company." Gates chuckled softly, never bothering to look up. "Very creative, Miss Crockett. Planning to write a financial novel." The viewers, even those only watching through the screen, could feel the blood rising to their temples. A woman bringing the truth into court, only to be mocked as though she were playing a part she had no right to. What ignited the anger wasn't just the judge's opposition. It was the fact that the whole room, every person in it, knew she was right, yet chose to sneer, to ignore, to suffocate her voice. This was all because she was Jasmine Crockett. All because she was a black woman daring to step into a place where they didn't want her to exist. Before Jasmine could take a step back from the podium, Gates's voice sliced through the silence again, this time sharper than before, reverberating across the courtroom. "So, you plan to mask your incompetence with a pile of boring documents." The words weren't just a legal challenge anymore. They were an outright personal attack, a strike meant to break her spirit. And the worst part was, it didn't come from an opposing attorney. This venomous remark came from the very person who was supposed to be the guardian of fairness, the one meant to uphold the neutrality of the law, the judge, the so-called symbol of justice. For a brief moment, the courtroom held its breath in complete silence. This was not because of surprise, but because this was a familiar, almost expected performance, a performance where power dictated who stood and who fell. The defense attorney, smug as ever, gave a slight nod, curling his lips into a barely concealed smirk. A court clerk near the door cleared his throat, unable to suppress his own amusement. A middle-aged man dressed in a blue suit muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Who does she think she is? She's probably just out of law school, doesn't even know how to read a report." The words echoed in the room, and yet no one said anything. No one challenged him, not even a glance from Gates, who looked over at the man as though silently agreeing with his sentiment. The cruel words cut through the air, but because they were spoken in the courtroom under the guise of official proceedings, they somehow became acceptable, legal. Jasmine stood motionless, her posture still erect, but her hands clenched, the files in her grip now feeling heavier than ever. She could feel the weight of each gaze, each one scrutinizing her, not to evaluate the evidence she was presenting, but to see how much pressure she could take, how long it would take before she crumbled, before she folded under their relentless disdain. A woman seated in the back row whispered, just loudly enough for her to catch the words, "Black female, and she thinks she can win here?" The words hung in the air, a sharp, cutting reminder that for some, her very presence in this courtroom was an affront. It wasn't just discrimination. It was the arrogant dismissal of someone who dared to challenge a system that was never meant for her, the same system that had always existed to serve the powerful and the privileged. And then, as though the assault on her dignity wasn't enough, Gates delivered another blow, this time without even the slightest attempt to disguise his contempt. "Miss Crockett, I strongly advise you to tone down these emotional theatrics. This is a courtroom, not some stage for the overdramatic performances of those who think they're victims." His words were like daggers aimed not just at her case, but at her very essence, her professional integrity. He wasn't just questioning her legal strategy. He was dismissing her as a person, as a professional, with nothing more than a casual sneer. And worse, no one, not a single soul in the room, stood up to defend her. No one even flinched. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with the stench of injustice. The audience, whether watching in person or behind the screens, could no longer sit idly by. The weight of the injustice was overwhelming. They felt her humiliation, her frustration, her anger on behalf of every person who had ever been underestimated, belittled, or discarded. She wasn't wrong. She was simply doing what was right. She was standing for the truth, for justice. But in a space where the truth was treated as an inconvenience, where a judge could use his position to crush someone beneath his power, there was no longer any hope of fairness. But Jasmine didn't lower her gaze. She didn't retreat. Even in the face of their mockery, their cruelty, and their overwhelming power, she stood tall, unwavering. Her chest rose and fell with steady breaths, and when she spoke again, her voice was calm, measured, but with an unspoken fire that couldn't be extinguished. Then I will let the next piece of evidence speak for itself. Her words cut through the room with clarity, each one deliberate, strong. She wasn't going to bend. She wasn't going to back down. Jasmine Crockett was not a woman who knelt before the injustices that sought to break her. But as she faced the oppressive weight of the system, a part of her knew the true question now wasn't whether she would break. It was who, in the end, would be the one to kneel. The atmosphere in the courtroom sickened after Gates's cold response, but Jasmine didn't let herself be dragged into the swelling tide of anger. She opened the second briefcase, pulling out a publicly available contract between the city and Charles Lawson's real estate development company, then gently placed it onto the projector. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, but each word seemed to squeeze the air from the room. "This is the initial budget approval contract, $12.5 million for the East Side residential redevelopment project. However, this budget statement, obtained from the Federal Budget Office, shows that Lawson's company received a total of $24.8 million. And what's even more significant is this." She turned the page. A new document appeared on the screen, a form allowing for out-of-budget transfers, signed and stamped with only one signature, Howard R. Gates. The name flashed clearly, dominating half the screen. In the now stunned room, every single person, whether the court clerk, the defense attorney, or the security officers, held their breath. No one spoke. No one moved. The signature was glaringly clear. It couldn't be forged. It couldn't be fabricated. It couldn't be denied. Jasmine didn't look at the screen, though. She kept her gaze locked on the judge, perched high on his bench where people still believed that conscience and justice could coexist. But now, both were being distorted by a single stroke of ink. Gates leaned forward slightly, clasped his hands, and glanced at the document with the disinterested air of someone perusing a restaurant menu. Then he muttered a curt, dismissive line, cold as ice, invalid. Jasmine furrowed her brows, hesitating for a beat. "Your Honor, this document was collected under subpoena from the State Department of Justice, authenticated, and stored in the federal system." But Gates was unwavering. "I said it's invalid, and it's invalid," he retorted. Then, for the first time in the entire trial, his eyes met hers directly. It was not as a judge assessing an argument, but as a man wielding absolute power to dismiss his opponent. A whisper briefly rose from the back row. "Oh my God, he really did sign it." A middle-aged woman covered her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. But Gates didn't care. He lightly tapped his gavel against the desk. "Document discarded. Move on." Jasmine's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the blatant audacity being legitimized in broad daylight. She had just presented clear evidence that an active judge had directly approved illegal budget transfers, and the entire system dismissed it as a mere typographical error. Justice, at this moment, wasn't just being overlooked, it was being trampled, distorted, all through the very pen that was supposed to protect the truth. And they called this procedural justice? The audience, no longer merely angry, began to feel something deeper, fear. Because if a judge could so nonchalantly discard evidence implicating himself, what would be left for the vulnerable, for those who had no power to fight back? Jasmine didn't back down. Calmly, she moved to the original document, this time with an attached seizure order signed by the State Inspector General's office, the red ink stamp still fresh. And here is the original copy from the Federal Archive, sealed by all 3 independent agencies, she said, her voice unwavering, as if no one had just tried to extinguish it with a mere dismissal. She projected the document onto the screen again, ensuring everyone in the room, including the cameras in the back, could see clearly the signature of Howard Gates approving the out-of-budget transfer, done just 6 days before Lawson purchased the redevelopment land at a price almost too good to be true. Gates stared at the screen for a few brief seconds, then suddenly turned away as if the very sight of his name sickened him. He raised an eyebrow, then looked at Jasmine with a gaze as cold and sharp as a piece of steel. "This is a forged document," his voice rang out, decisive, unflinching. But there was no evidence, no explanation, no justification to back it up. No legal reference, no argument, just a statement from the one in power. And it was as if the room had been nailed shut. No one reacted. No one asked for clarification. Jasmine stood still for a few moments, not because she was confused, but because she understood. She understood that she was no longer presenting in a fair trial. There were no more rules being applied, no procedural principles that protected the truth. This was all a stage, and the director was wearing the robes of a judge, both the criminal and the mastermind behind the eraser of justice. A court officer quietly approached the prosecution table, under the guise of adjusting the microphone, but subtly whispered something to the court clerk. They laughed. The man at the back of the room holding the camera shifted the lens away from the screen displaying the evidence, redirecting it toward Lawson, who remained seated calmly, his face suggesting he knew exactly how everything would be wiped clean. None of them were shocked. No one objected because they were all accustomed to living in the shadow of Gates. And for Jasmine, the truth no longer felt like a sharp knife. It was simply the excuse they used to suffocate her in broad daylight. Her fist clenched tightly, her nails digging into her palm hard enough to sting. But she didn't scream. She didn't beg. She didn't plead. She only looked directly at the man on the high bench with a cold, unyielding gaze, no longer directed at a judge, but at a criminal hiding behind the veil of power. And in that moment, it felt as though the audience collectively held their breath because they began to understand. The man sitting in judgment was the one who had signed off on the crime, and he had just casually wiped everything away in front of dozens of people in a country that called itself a symbol of justice. The courtroom still simmered, thick with tension after Gates's blatant dismissal. He remained seated in his high chair, hands folded, an image of someone who believed he had already won. Lawson, the defendant, reclined in his seat, one leg casually draped over the other, as though he were waiting for his morning coffee to arrive. The room was eerily quiet. No one dared to speak up, no one challenging the power in the room. Jasmine knew with stark clarity that the truth wasn't just being suffocated. It was being buried alive by a system so corrupt that it had already rotted from within. But she wasn't about to let it end here. She stood in the center of the storm, her gaze locked with Gates's cold, sneering contempt. And this time, she made the move. A sharp crackle came from the small speaker on the prosecution table. The static cleared, and a familiar, deep voice rang out, dripping with venom. "Make sure that girl never gets near the ledger." Understood. The air in the room, already thick with tension, felt suddenly suffocating. The crowd packed into the small space seemed to lose its breath. Every head turned, eyes wide in disbelief. Pens dropped, and a few recorders froze momentarily before resuming their steady clicking. Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood there, stone-faced, her voice steady and commanding, yet with a weight that seemed to press down on every single person in the room. Did everyone just hear whose voice that was? No one dared answer, but they didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew exactly who it was. It was Howard Gates's voice, unmistakable, undeniable, and irrefutable. No longer could this be dismissed as just a signature or a speculative accusation. This was a living, breathing voice, a voice commanding the concealment of evidence, manipulating the process, and obstructing justice itself. A voice belonging to the man who had sworn to uphold the law, yet was the very one tearing it apart from within. Gates leaned forward slightly, his face drained of color for a brief moment before it flushed bright red, his anger palpable. "This recording is illegal. It cannot be presented in court." His voice cracked for the first time, showing real unease. breaking the veneer of control he had held so tightly throughout the trial. But this was no longer a legal objection. It was a desperate cry from someone who knew he had been exposed. Jasmine, undeterred, didn't let him regain control. She calmly retrieved the printed copy of the valid warrant, raising it high so everyone in the room could see. This is a legally obtained recording, authorized by the state prosecutor's office and verified by the federal inspector 3 weeks ago. I have adhered to every legal protocol. A low murmur spread through the jury. One of them whispered, "I can't believe this." In the back row, a woman gripped her purse tightly, leaning toward her friend with disbelief in her eyes. "It's him. It's really him." The anger among the audience had shifted, no longer a mere response, but an explosion of realization. The truth had been laid bare, and now what they had witnessed wasn't just an isolated case of misconduct. It was a systemic failure, a deliberate erasure of justice. But it wasn't just the jury and the audience who saw it. The weight of the moment crashed down on everyone who had been complicit in keeping the truth buried. The room was no longer just filled with silence. It was filled with tension, with a collective holding of breath. Jasmine stepped forward, her movements deliberate, taking another breath before pressing play once more. The same voice blared from the speaker. "I don't care how. Just make sure she never touches the ledger." "Got it." The words echoed like a hammer striking the last remnants of illusion. It was no longer a question of what was right or wrong. It was a question of who was willing to stand up and face the truth, no matter the consequences. At that moment, the facade cracked completely. The mask of authority that Gates had worn for so long shattered, revealing the reality beneath. A man who had abused his power, who had betrayed the very oath he swore to uphold. And yet the system, his system, had been working tirelessly to protect him, to make sure that no one would question him, that no one would stand in his way. Jasmine didn't back down, her gaze cold and unwavering, locked onto Gates as if she were passing judgment herself. There was no need for a verdict now. Her eyes were the sentence. And in that instant, the entire room seemed to understand. This wasn't a battle between a prosecutor and a defendant anymore. This wasn't even about a case or a trial. This was about something much larger. A confrontation between an individual determined to speak the truth and an entire system of power that had become so corrupt, so self-serving, that it had forgotten what justice even meant. The system that had stood unchallenged for so long, the system that had protected men like Gates, was finally beginning to tremble. And it was trembling because Jasmine, a single woman, stood unbroken in the face of its rot. It was trembling because, for the first time in this trial, the truth had a voice, and that voice was hers. The shockwave from the recording had yet to settle when Jasmine, with an air of quiet authority, pulled out a thick folder from her case, its edges marked with the unmistakable seal of the federal government. She opened it carefully, revealing the exact transcript of the audio just played. Each line, transcribed with precision, was time-stamped and bore the seal of an independent audio examiner. She laid the transcript down on the prosecution table and, with deliberate calm, pushed it toward the judge's bench, as though presenting the final blow before delivering her verdict. Gates stared at the transcript as if it were a stain he couldn't remove, a mark that would follow him forever. For a brief moment, his face turned ghostly pale, the confident pink of his lips draining away, leaving only the grim shade of a man caught in his own web of deceit. His eyes darted quickly, first to the court clerk, then to Lawson's defense attorney, and finally landing on the cameraman behind him. But every single set of eyes in the room seemed to avoid his gaze, as if the truth in that transcript were fire, and anyone who dared look at it risked being consumed by its flames. Gates, with an almost violent motion, stood up from his chair. His hands slammed onto the table as if to hold himself steady. His gavel hit the wood with a force that echoed across the courtroom, louder than ever before. "This trial is over," he bellowed, his voice booming through the air. But it lacked the authority it once had. It wasn't a decree, it was a desperate scream, a final, futile attempt to regain control. But Jasmine did not flinch. She did not retreat or bow to the storm of authority. She stood straight, tall, and unyielding. Her voice, though not raised, rang out clearly, like the strike of a bell in the silence of the room. "No, you do not end this when you do not have the right." Her words were simple, without theatrics or dramatization, but they struck like lightning in a storm. The power behind them rattled the room. Gates paused. He didn't move. His eyes widened, as if her words had physically pushed him back, like a sudden pull against gravity. The world around him, the gavel, the robe, the high bench, the power he had once wielded with ease, suddenly seemed laughable. It was all so fragile, so absurd. The man who had used his position to crush others now found himself defenseless, unable to stop the truth that had swept through the courtroom in the span of a heartbeat. Jasmine had done what many before her had been too afraid to do. She had stripped him of his power. She had forced him into the open, where there was no more room to hide behind his gavel or his robe, no more legal loophole or pretentious authority to shield him. A single recording, a single mistake, had done what years of legal arguments could never achieve. The entire courtroom fell into silence, thick with the weight of what had just unfolded. The recording, which had seemed like a whisper just moments ago, now hung heavily in the air, suffocating the very space where justice had once been presumed to exist. Jasmine, still standing, her gaze unflinching, held her ground. She wasn't just presenting evidence anymore. She was declaring, in no uncertain terms, that the law had been violated, that justice had been distorted, and that a man who was supposed to embody the law had become its greatest abuser. Gates stumbled back, his face a mask of disbelief. He clenched his jaw, his knuckles white against the wood of the desk, as if he were trying to hold on to something, anything, to preserve the illusion of control. But it was slipping away, and he knew it. He looked around the room, eyes scanning, looking for someone, anyone, to help him, to stop the momentum that Jasmine had set into motion. But there was no one. Not a single person in that room stood up to defend him. Not the attorneys, not the jury, not even the court staff. Jasmine's voice broke the silence again, firm and unyielding. This is not over. Not until the truth is recognized for what it is. Her words were simple, yet they hung in the air, heavy and unassailable, as if they alone were enough to bring the entire corrupt system crashing down. Gates, his face now flushed with fury, stood up abruptly, trying to regain control, but his movements seemed slow and calculated, like a man desperate to hold on to something he couldn't grasp. He looked at Jasmine, his eyes narrowing in anger, but there was no more power in his gaze. There was only fear, the fear that comes when one realizes they are no longer in control. This is madness, Gates shouted, but his voice cracked. You've gone too far, Miss Crockett. But Jasmine, unshaken, took another step forward. The weight of the room pressed in on her, but she didn't bend. The truth has already gone too far, she said, her voice steady. And I'm not the one who took it there. You did. The air in the courtroom had shifted. It wasn't just the temperature, it wasn't just the tension. It was the feeling of something breaking, of something irreparable shattering before their eyes. Gates, once the embodiment of power in that room, was now stripped bare, exposed for the world to see. And in that moment, as he stood before the very people he had once lorded over, there was no longer any dignity in his posture. There was no longer any nobility in his role. All that was left was a man, an ordinary man, caught in the weight of his own lies. As the reality of what had just happened sank in, the room seemed to inhale collectively. And for the first time in this trial, people began to understand. This wasn't about a legal case anymore. This was about something much larger, something much more profound. This was about justice, not just for the state, but for everyone who had been crushed under the weight of a system that had lost its way. And for the first time, the people in that room saw that with one voice, Jasmine had managed to expose the cracks in the very foundation of that system. She had done the impossible. She had made them see the truth. And in that moment, the power that Gates had once wielded, the confidence he had shown in his years of unchecked authority, all evaporated. He was no longer the judge. He was no longer the one in control, because the truth, once unleashed, was a force more powerful than any gavel, any robe, or any title. And as Gates stood there, powerless and exposed, Jasmine realized that this was not just a victory for her. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced, a victory for those who had fought for justice even when the system was rigged against them. And now, for the first time, the system was trembling because they could no longer pretend They could no longer ignore what had been laid bare before them. And the one person who had the courage to stand up, Jasmine Crockett, had done what no one had dared to do before. She had made them face the truth. And in doing so, she had set justice free. The deafening silence hung over the courtroom for several long seconds after Jasmine's words, as if the entire space were holding its breath in anticipation of the storm that was about to break. And then, the sound of the courtroom doors swinging open. Two federal officers in dark blue uniforms strode in, their heavy steps echoing across the marble floor. They said nothing at first, no need to. Their mere presence was enough to make everything in the room. The sound of the cameras, the quiet breaths of the audience, all tightened like the string of a bow. Jasmine didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She had known this moment would come. One of the officers stepped forward, pulling a piece of paper from his pocket. His voice rang out clearly, like thunder breaking the stillness. Howard Gates, pursuant to the orders of the U.S. Attorney General's office and the federal investigation, you are being arrested for obstruction of justice, abuse of judicial power, and aiding in the embezzlement of public funds. The room seemed to explode in a gust of cold air. Every pair of eyes snapped toward the high bench, where just moments ago the words of arrogant judgment had echoed through the air. Gates stood motionless, his eyes widened, his mouth slightly parted, as if he were about to say something, perhaps to refute, to deny, or simply to salvage whatever was left of the title of federal judge he had clung to all his life. But no sound came out. There were no arguments, no dignity, and above all, no one in the room believed in the power he once represented. The handcuffs gleamed under the overhead lights, the cold light reflecting off the bright steel. The sharp click echoed as the cuffs locked around Gates's wrists, each sound reverberating like a sentence that needed no gavel. The man who had forced hundreds of people to kneel before him, the one who had turned justice into a tool for punishing the vulnerable, now bowed his head, not in humility, but because he no longer had the strength to keep it raised. A king in a black robe, the supreme symbol of the law, was now just a criminal, shackled in front of the press, the jury, and a nation watching. No one in the room stood to protest, no shouts, no words of intervention. All that remained were the gazes from the reporters, from the citizens, from the court clerk, even from those who had scoffed when Jasmine first entered the courtroom. Now all eyes were locked on that moment. They were witnessing a man once considered untouchable being dragged from the bench like any other criminal. And they understood. The punishment this time didn't come from a system, but from the truth that Gates could no longer suffocate. Jasmine remained standing in her place. She didn't smile, didn't shed a tear, but her gaze in that moment was cold, not because of a lack of emotion, but because she knew what had just happened wasn't victory. It was simply a repayment, a small part of the debt of justice that society had neglected for so many years. And the anger of the viewers, from the very beginning of this case, had now been transformed into a retaliatory blow, powerful, clear, and impossible to ignore. Gates was escorted past Jasmine, his posture hunched, no longer the imposing judge who once sat firmly atop the high bench, but a small, pitiful figure bound by the very handcuffs he once ordered others to wear in his courtroom. As he passed her, their eyes met for a fleeting moment. There was no longer any mockery, no arrogance, no armor of power in his gaze. All that remained was fear and a sense of shame so foreign to him that it was almost unrecognizable. A man who had spent years believing he was untouchable, only to realize in this moment that everything had come crashing down. But Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She didn't nod in triumph like people might do in movies. She simply stood still, motionless, like an unwitting witness, one who doesn't need to take an oath to tell the truth. For her, this wasn't a moment to celebrate, not because she felt nothing, but because, deep in her mind, she knew this wasn't a victory. This was the truth that should have come a long time ago. She thought back to the people who had stood before this very bench, the poor clients who had been harshly judged simply for not being able to afford decent lawyers, the black mothers pleading for time for their sons to live decently, the workers who were falsely accused for daring to sue the companies that exploited them. All of them had once lowered their heads under the cold hand of a judge, none other than Gates, who had the privilege to decide who was worthy of being heard and who was to be discarded like trash. And now, The man who once controlled the fates of hundreds was now controlled by his own hands. The courtroom was silent. Even the usual click-clack of cameras was gone. The reporters, court staff, judicial officers, each one stood frozen, witnessing something they had never seen before. A federal judge being arrested in the very courtroom where he had once sat in the highest seat. And as the two officers led Gates out through the large door, none of them looked away. They watched him leave, not out of curiosity, but because everyone, were witnessing something rare. True justice was not the black robe, but the people who dared to lift it, revealing the blood and rot beneath. Jasmine lowered her gaze for a moment, not to hide, but to swallow down all the memories of the humiliation, of the scornful words, of the files rejected without reason. And she knew this was only the beginning. The anger within her hadn't disappeared. It had just taken on a clearer shape, punishment. But the system was still there, and she couldn't stop. Not when so many like Gates were still using the law as a shield to protect their hands stained with crime. The courtroom door slammed shut behind Howard Gates, sealing off the man who had once stood as the symbol of judicial power. The air in the room grew thick with a heavy, suffocating silence, not because of the absence of a judge, but because the shadow of authority that had loomed over them all was suddenly gone. The power that had seemed unshakable was now exposed for all to see. And yet, within that silence, another presence shifted uneasily: Charles Lawson. The man who had been lounging comfortably in his seat, playing the part of the passive observer, suddenly stirred. His fingers began to tap nervously on the table, an unconscious gesture that revealed more about his state of mind than any words ever could. His forehead beaded with sweat, his palms clammy, despite the cool air from the courtroom's air conditioning. Jasmine wasted no time. She recognized the shift in him. The man who had once seemed untouchable, now appearing to fidget under the weight of his own guilt. She turned her eyes toward him, cold and unrelenting, like a predator locked onto its prey. Her step was measured, deliberate. As she moved toward the defendant's table, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't in a rush. She didn't need to be. But her presence alone was enough to make Lawson squirm, enough to force him to look away. She approached slowly, deliberately, every step echoing in the courtroom like a drumbeat signaling the final act. "Mr. Lawson," she spoke, her voice steady and controlled, each word cutting through the silence with an icy precision. "You just saw what happened to a man who thought he was untouchable." Her eyes locked with his, piercing and unmoving. Lawson didn't respond. His gaze darted around the room, looking for any sign of support, any ally that might intervene. But Gates was now in handcuffs, and Lawson's legal team, once so confident, was reduced to nervous glances and trembling silence. The very people who had once stood beside him were now reduced to mere bystanders, powerless in the face of the truth. Jasmine moved closer, her hand resting on the thick stack of documents laid out on the prosecution table. She could feel the weight of the evidence, the weight of every word, every document that had been gathered to expose the corruption that had plagued the system for so long. She turned a page, a deliberate motion, and slid it across the table toward Lawson. "Your signature is right here," she said, her voice low but full of authority, alongside Gates's signature. "Do you really think your name won't be on an arrest warrant before long?" Lawson swallowed hard, the sound audible in the silence of the room. His throat was dry, his pulse quickening. Just moments ago, he had been the powerful real estate mogul, the man who thought he could buy his way out of anything. He had been untouchable, a king in his domain. But now, with one simple motion, his entire empire had started to crumble. Gates had fallen, and Lawson knew all too well that when one part of a corrupt system collapses, the rest of it often follows. Jasmine stood tall, unwavering, her gaze fixed firmly on his. Her voice softened, but it carried a weight that no one in the room could ignore. "Do you want to keep your life?" she asked, her words simple, yet laced with a quiet fury that made the entire room shudder. It wasn't just a question directed at him. It was a challenge that had been building for years. Lawson visibly flinched, his face reeling with a mix of anger and fear. For the first time, he seemed small, insignificant. The facade of confidence that had once made him so untouchable was now gone, replaced by a man desperate to hold on to whatever semblance of control he had left. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes flicking around the room, looking for an escape that wasn't there. Jasmine didn't wait for him to respond. She leaned in, her voice dropping even lower but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Start talking, or you'll be the next one dragged out of this courtroom with shiny handcuffs on your wrists." Her words hung in the air, and the room felt like it had frozen in place. It was as if time itself had come to a halt. The audience, whether sitting in the courtroom or watching from a screen, could feel the power of that moment. The weight of the truth was undeniable. Jasmine wasn't just speaking to Lawson anymore. She was speaking to every person who had ever been complicit in the corruption that had tainted the system for so long. She was speaking to every person who had turned a blind eye to the injustice, to the people who had been crushed beneath the weight of those in power. The moment wasn't just about exposing one man's guilt. It was about bringing down a system that had been built on lies, on manipulation, on the abuse of power. It was about showing that justice wasn't just about winning a case. It was about bringing the truth to light, no matter the cost. And in that moment, Lawson understood. He understood that Jasmine wasn't just here to win a case. She was here to expose the very foundation of corruption that had allowed men like him and men like Gates to operate unchecked. She was here to tear down the walls that had protected the guilty for far too long. And as the tension in the room reached its peak, one thing became clear. The fight wasn't just for one man's downfall. It was a fight for justice itself, a fight that had been a long time coming, and one that Jasmine was determined to win. And with every word she spoke, with every step she took, she was making sure that the truth would never again be buried. Not by power, not by fear, and certainly not by the men who thought they could control it all. Lawson sat there, his lips tightly pressed together, his hands clasped on the table, but trembling ever so slightly. His face, the face of a man who had once approved multi-billion-dollar projects, a man who had been hailed by the media as the new generation urban architect, was now pale, drained of all color. He didn't speak immediately, but Jasmine remained standing, unwavering, her eyes fixed on him. She knew men like Lawson, men who never feared justice but feared being dragged into the light, losing control in front of the public eye, and having the mask they had so carefully crafted over decades ripped away. Finally, Lawson exhaled sharply, tugging at his tie as if the air in the room had suddenly become too thick to breathe. I need protection," he stammered, his voice no longer carrying the arrogance it once had. It was a surrender not to justice, but to the harsh reality. His greatest shield, Howard Gates, had just been shattered before the eyes of millions. Jasmine didn't respond with anything more than a subtle nod, but inside her, something shifted. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't relief. It was a surge of tension because she knew the game had only just begun. What Lawson was about to reveal could be the key to unraveling a labyrinth of power, a network connecting politics, business, and the judiciary. Those who had long treated America as their private playground and the law as a tool to serve their wealth. She stepped closer, pulling out a prepared deposition form she had ready. She didn't ask, "Why are you speaking now?" She didn't need him to confess for the sake of his conscience. She knew better. The real puppet master is never the innocent one. And what made her anger flare wasn't that Lawson had blood on his hands, but that he had manipulated an entire system that had crushed so many innocent lives. People who had been wrongly accused, left in poverty, lost their homes, and their right to live while he was still celebrated as a reformer. She placed the pen on the table, then said, her gaze unwavering, "I need the list. Everyone involved." Lawson nodded, swallowing hard. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable, but all Jasmine saw was one thing. How many others were still lurking, still sitting in leather chairs in high-rise offices, still donating to political campaigns, still signing orders that the poor would never have the chance to challenge? And for that reason, she couldn't stop, not because she sought revenge, but because the anger inside her, and inside the hearts of millions who had been crushed by this system, would never cool as long as the truth remained buried. And Lawson, no matter how many names he gave up, was just a small link in a chain that had existed far too long without ever being called by its true name, legalized crime. 1 week after the historic trial, the chambers of the United States Congress were no longer a place for empty promises or dull political speeches. On that day, The entire nation seemed to hold its breath as Jasmine Crockett, dressed in a solemn black suit, walked to the podium amidst hundreds of lawmakers, reporters, and ordinary citizens who had traveled for hours to be there. Behind her stood the symbol of the nation, the American flag, fluttering proudly. But this time, it wasn't a symbol of pride. It was a painful reminder that justice, at times, is betrayed within the very institution meant to protect it. Jasmine placed the thick file down on the podium. She didn't need papers. She didn't need a prepared speech because what she was about to say wasn't a speech. It was an indictment of the conscience. "I stand here today," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, "not to recount the trial that has passed, but to remind everyone that we cannot call this a nation of justice if the one wearing the robe of a judge is the very one who betrays the truth." The area below was stunned, many holding their breath. An elderly woman, perhaps a mother who had seen her child wrongfully imprisoned for years, had tears streaming down her face. A black veteran stood, his fist clenched, as if trying to hold back something that had broken in his heart long ago. Jasmine locked eyes with them, with the entire country through the millions of screens broadcasting live, and continued, "When someone like Howard Gates can sit on the bench for nearly 2 decades while quietly selling justice to the rich, the fault does not lie only with him. It lies with all of us, the ones who let silence become complicity." And then, from the gallery, one person stood, then two, then dozens. They didn't shout, they didn't chant. They just stood quietly as a declaration. "We understand, and we will not stay silent anymore." Applause erupted. It wasn't loud like the cheers of a campaign rally. It was subdued, an applause heavy with tears. It wasn't adoration. It was the acknowledgement of pain. It was the rage that had been buried for so long, finally named for what it was and led into action. Jasmine lowered her voice, delivering the final words not as a prosecutor, not as a congresswoman, but as a human being. No one is untouchable. No seat is high enough to remain untouched. And if we truly want to live in a just country, then it is we, the people, who must rebuild justice through truth and through the anger we've been taught to suppress. And in that moment, a society began to change, not through guns, not through blood, but through a voice that dared to call out injustice right at the heart of power. In a small apartment on the south side of Chicago, an old television sitting in the corner of the room was broadcasting the live news from Congress. The light from the screen reflected on the dark face of an 8-year-old girl, her eyes wide open, not blinking, as if afraid to miss even a moment. She didn't fully understand the big words Jasmine Crockett was speaking from the podium, but she understood that gaze. The gaze of a woman who had endured enough, who had stood up, and who had changed something no one dared touch. Sitting next to her was her mother, a night shift nurse just home from a 14-hour workday, slumped against the sofa, her eyes tired. But when Jasmine's final words echoed from the screen, "We cannot let this anger die in silence. Let it become the reason no one else has to fall like this again," the mother lifted her head. And then, the little girl turned to her, her voice soft but powerful, like a promise whispered into history. "Mom, I want to be like her." That statement wasn't heard in a grand hall. It didn't reach the ears of politicians, but it carried more weight than any applause because it marked something crucial. A well-timed outrage might not change the past, but it will shape the future. Jasmine couldn't see that little girl, but she had sparked a fire, not just in the courtroom, but in millions of minds that had quietly waited to be awakened across the states. From single mothers in Baltimore to law students at UCLA, from war veterans to homeless people in New York, everyone saw something they had long feared to believe, that the system could be overturned if someone dared to expose it in the light. And that light wasn't born from eloquent words, nor from elections or power, but from a trial where justice was violated and then reclaimed through anger that had never cooled. Anger, if suppressed, becomes resentment, but if guided, it becomes the reason for the next generation to never bow their heads. And from one whispered promise in that small room, thousands of children, black, brown, white, began to see the world with new eyes, not because justice had been perfected, but because now they knew. If someone like Jasmine Crockett could do this, then tomorrow, they could too. If this made you feel something, anger, hope, or the urge to stand up for what's right, then you already understand why stories like these must be told. Justice isn't just a system. It's a fight carried by voices like Jasmine's and by people like you who choose to listen. Don't let this be the end. Join us. Subscribe to Emotional Journey to never miss another real, raw, and unforgettable story that challenges injustice, uplifts courage, and reminds us all that silence is never the answer because the next story might be the one that changes everything. Hit that subscribe button. Let's walk this journey together.